Hey, Larkin Rose here. Every once in a while somebody forwards me a link to some anti-anarchist propaganda or article or opinion piece. And I was recently sent one that was titled 5 Reasons Why I'm Not an Anarchist, written by Austin Petersen and published in thelibertarianrepublic.com. So right off the bat it's published on an oxymoron website, since libertarianism is about the non-aggression principle and a republic is a ruling class that coercively controls and extorts people. Therefore, a libertarian republic is contradiction. But whatever. Now, in the description I saw of the article, the little tagline, whatever you call it, it said, this isn't in the actual article, but I'm pretty sure that Austin wrote this, it says, quote, "I used to be an anarcho-capitalist until I took a constitutional law course to the brain." As you will see, he never understood anarchism and he doesn't understand the Constitution. Now, the Constitution is a statist document. It's not anarchist, but he doesn't even manage to be a constitutionalist statist while pretending he is. So, here's the article. I'll respond to it piece by piece. He starts, quote, "What does it mean to be a constitutional libertarian? It means you don't really know how to think. Because the Constitution, among other things, pretends to give Congress the power to steal people's money. That is not libertarian, that is aggression." So, to be a constitutional libertarian means that you don't really know how to think clearly. He goes on, ever heard of minarchy before? Probably not. Okay. But if you've ever debated an anarchist and felt like they had an incomplete understanding of the basics of force, fraud, life, liberty, or property, then this list is for you. As you will see, talk about pot calling the kettle black. So here are his 5 reasons why he's not an anarchist. Number 1, rights are guarantees. Absolutely, patently, utterly, completely false. A right is not a guarantee. It is a moral statement about a negative. To say you have the right to do X means only that nobody else should forcibly interfere with you doing X. It doesn't guarantee you will be able to do X. Otherwise, Austin can't possibly believe anybody has a right to do anything, because there's never been a time in history when any individual has had a guarantee that he would be able to speak his mind, or be armed, or be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, or any of that. If it's a guarantee, it means nothing can make this not happen. That has never been the case. So he starts right off the bat with a complete falsehood, rights are guarantees. He elaborates, a right is something that must be provided. Again, completely wrong. This is the socialist viewpoint, that a right is something somebody else has to give to you, has to provide to you. It's not. A right is only a negative. It's something other people don't have the moral justification to interfere with. That's all. They don't have to do anything for you. They have to refrain from doing something to you if you are exercising your rights. That's the only rational definition that the concept of a right can possibly have. It isn't a list of magical things that you're entitled to. And it's a little odd that somebody who took a constitutional law course doesn't know that. Quote, any society aimed at protecting natural rights must use some type of force to guarantee those rights. Now that would be true if you actually understood what rights meant. Like, if we want to protect people from being robbed and attacked, and there are bad people who would do that, you need good people who use force to stop them. But that is not what he's talking about. Quote, any mechanism of force used to guarantee those rights have the same effect as government, no matter what that form may take. Utterly false. If somebody attacks you and you defend yourself, that doesn't make you government. If somebody attacks you and somebody else defends you, that doesn't make them government. But he's just declaring out of the blue, completely falsely, that if you protect your rights, that's government in action. Quote, if there is a natural right to a lawyer if you are accused of a crime, there is not a natural right to a lawyer. Lawyers are not a naturally occurring phenomenon. But let me finish the sentence. If there is a natural right to a lawyer if you are accused of a crime, then that right means that there must be resources expended to provide citizens with a defense against the government's accusations. there you have the absolute socialist mindset that you're entitled to somebody, therefore it's okay to forcibly confiscate resources, money, from somebody else to pay to provide you with that thing. Now, if you accept that premise, you have no reason to be a constitutionalist. You have a reason to be a collectivist authoritarian socialist, which that is the fundamental essence of Austin's position. Because I'm pretty damn sure most people would agree that having food is a little more important than having a defense attorney. Therefore, does that not follow, based on his really bad logic and unprincipled thinking, that it's okay to rob everybody to give you food? Because golly, you need food because you die without food. Therefore, let's have a giant socialist authoritarian utopia that so that resources can be expended to provide citizens, like, so you have a natural right to a defense attorney, but not food. It's just contradictory mush. He goes on to talk. I'm not going to. I'll put the link in the description so you can read his whole article. I'm not going to cover all of it because some of it is just, not worth going into in detail. He talks about how a private system would be justice for sale to the highest bidder. That's called reality, and the only other alternative is robbery. It's like saying, when you go to the supermarket, the best food is only for the people who can afford it. No freaking kidding. That's called reality. And the only reason to change that, the only way to change that is either if somebody who has more money decides to voluntarily give it to them, that's not what he's talking about, or if the state comes along and violently forces somebody to pay for something for somebody else. That is what he's talking about. And that is authoritarian socialism. It's not libertarian. It's not even constitutional. So he gets two layers of unclear thinking. Quote, for that reason, making sure everyone has justice, nice joke. For that reason, the Constitution laid out the means for citizens to be protected from unreasonable searches and seizures, cruel or unusual punishments, or from things like double jeopardy. There's a flying disconnect here. He mentions things in the Bill of Rights that say what government isn't allowed to do. He doesn't mention the fact that the only reason the Bill of Rights has to be there is because the Constitution created a freaking ruling class which was likely to do those things. And it does those things constantly. And he's trying to credit the Constitution with being the thing that makes these not happen, even though it created the institution that makes those things happen in every freaking State of the Union every freaking day. Now, it's also a leap of logic because the Bill of Rights doesn't restrict anybody except government. It's not a list of what nobody's allowed to do to you. It's a list of what Congress is not allowed to do to you. And they do it anyway. But he's saying people must be protected. That's why we have the Bill of Rights. The only thing that protects them from is the government, and it doesn't protect them from the government, and it's part of the document that created the government that victimizes them. So it's like pointing to the mafia when the mafia wrote down, "We'll be nice," and saying, thank goodness the mafia is here to write down, "We'll be nice," otherwise somebody might hurt you. Oh, they broke a kneecap. Darn. Well, you can go to the mafia court and ask them to please declare that they shouldn't have done that. And he goes on, quote, "It means that while citizens have the right to defend themselves, they must also be defended if they are too weak to defend themselves." And by must be, he means it's okay to forcibly rob a bunch of other people to pay for somebody to defend them. He doesn't just mean mutual voluntary arrangement, because there's a word for that. It's called anarchy. He says, members of the Arizona militia don't worry about home invasions, but 90-year-old grandmothers in Massachusetts might. The federal government doesn't worry about home invasions either, by the way. That's not federal jurisdiction. But the implication is if we don't have a ruling class, nobody will care about the 90-year-old grandmother getting attacked in her home. Because the militia in Arizona isn't going to go to Massachusetts to save the little old lady, that means we need a ruling class violently robbing all of us to protect the little old lady. Often when I see things like this, I wonder if the person isn't projecting. I would want to protect the little old lady. Wouldn't Austin? I would care about that. He said, members of the Arizona militia don't worry about home invasions. They don't care about that. I'm pretty sure a member of the Arizona militia, if the neighbor's being attacked, he's going to care. He might not bother to call the militia, but I bet he will care. This is Austin basically doing the routine of pretending that his desire for dominating his fellow man counts as compassion, because he cares more than you. Those militia types, they don't care, but I care, so I'm willing to rob you to pay for protection for somebody else, and then I want credit for being charitable instead of being a control freak dude. Quote, public security for those who can't protect themselves is a natural right. No, it freaking isn't. You can't have a right to something that somebody else has to provide for you. And this is, this is after him saying a constitutional law course is what, made him not be an anarchist. He wasn't paying very much attention because the constitutional law course had to cover the fact that natural rights mean something that other people shouldn't interfere with. It doesn't mean free goodies for all. He mentions the unborn, like he wants them protected, just as an irrelevant aside. Number 2, an anarchist society is unable to protect its citizens from foreign invasion. Now this is a thing I've talked about a million times before, and I'm going to do a video about it soon, so I won't get into too much depth about this. But basically what he's saying is if you have a group of people, a heavily armed group of people in the case of this country, they're not going to organize and they're not going to defend themselves unless you get a bunch of politicians stealing their money and paying somebody else to do it. And of course he doesn't express it that way because then it sounds as stupid as it is. He says, quote, a fully anarchist society with no collective means of defense. Who says they have no collective means of defense? All anarchy means is they don't have somebody violently forcing them to go along with the politician's version of defense. It doesn't mean they can't organize. Like Austin, go to a supermarket. The government didn't force that to happen. Everybody is there voluntarily. It's amazingly organized, and it doesn't require authority. Funny thing is, he talks about no collective means of defense after mentioning the Arizona militia, which is a non-government organized means of defense. So way to go. Anyway, a fully anarchist society, he says, with no collective means of defense, wrong, is at the mercy of foreign powers who have not abdicated such means of survival. Which is an awkward sentence. An anarchist state is at the mercy of anyone who wishes to expand in their territory unchecked. The Native Americans can attest to this. That's pretty damn funny. Like, actually, it's pretty damn sad. Thank goodness for the Constitution, and 2 seconds later he's pointing out the mass murder that was a result and committed by the government created by the Constitution that this guy worships. Look at the injustice that happened to the Indians. Hooray for the Constitution! 1 + 1 = 2. The Constitution laid out the means through which American society can protect itself. The Constitution created the thing that you just complained about slaughtering the Indians. And no, it doesn't lay out the means by which American society can protect itself. And the whole idea that, we could never defend ourselves if there aren't tax collectors and politicians, because we could never organize otherwise. It's just bogus. And I'm going to do a video about the actual, how much more difficult it is from the viewpoint of the invading nasty guy to take over a country that is anarchist, because there's nobody who can surrender. You don't just go in and take over the existing structure like the Nazis when they took over France. They just sort of shuffle things around a little bit, and then you got the Vichy government, collaborators, there, already set up. We already have the tax base, we already have the control mechanism. Try to do that. Let's say you had 300 million anarchists in the US, 100 million of them armed. Nobody can walk in and say, all right, now we're in charge. I've said it a million times, the only gang in the world capable of oppressing the US people is the one that's already doing it. And the only reason they can get away with it is because they've duped people like Austin into believing there is legitimacy to the domination and the extortion, and believing that they are our protectors when they rob us and control us. So there's only one gang capable of doing it, and it's already doing it. China cannot do it, Russia cannot do it, nobody else can do it. He goes on, quote, if I band together with my neighbors to form a mutual defense pact, and we call that a constitution, it would necessarily have the same effect as government. No, it freaking wouldn't. Again, totally muddle-headed thinking. Apparently, Austin cannot differentiate between the two following scenarios. Hey, Bob, If somebody attacks me, can I give you a call? And if somebody attacks you, you give me a call, we'll help each other out? Yeah, we can do that. That's scenario one. Perfectly valid, perfectly moral, non-authoritarian, perfectly fine in an anarchist society. Scenario number two. Hey Bob, wouldn't it be great if we forced Fred to pay for somebody to protect us? That's government. And apparently Austin can't distinguish between voting for somebody to violently dominate your neighbors to protect you and actual mutual cooperation and voluntary self-defense. So he says it would necessarily have the same effect as government. No, it wouldn't. Because if Bob and I say, hey, let's help protect ourselves if anybody attacks us, we don't suddenly imagine that we have the right to tax Fred. Quote, if government is to exist, its number one job is to protect citizens' liberties. It's the number one statist mythology. Load of bunk. And after that, to protect their lives through a reasonable national defense that is not overly interventionist or burdensome on its taxpayers. So its number one job is to protect your liberties, and by the way, it has to steal your money in order to do it. That is just the essence of the lunacy of statism. We need it to be able to rob you. I mean, he just came right out and said, it has to be able to force you to hand over resources so it can protect your liberties. Stockholm Syndrome on display. It's bad enough when the politicians say, yeah, we need to violently control you and rob you to protect you. When its victims say, yeah, they need to violently rob us and control us in order to protect us. Pretty damn sad. He talks about how citizens should be allowed to defend themselves. Good, like Second Amendment stuff. Quote, they should be free to join together for mutual protection. Good. Didn't you just say they wouldn't do that? Oh well. They should be free to join together for mutual protection, provided they do not infringe on the fundamental natural rights of other citizens in doing so. Austin, when you're done arguing with yourself, get back to me. Because when you put in, provided they do not infringe on the fundamental rights of others, you just ruled out government. You just argued exactly against what you've been saying the whole time, which is government is allowed to infringe on your liberty and take your money in order to protect you. And then he says, people can mutually cooperate to defend themselves as long as they don't violate the individual rights of somebody else. So please make up your mind. Number three, anarchy means the non-aggression principle is optional. It's always optional. People can choose to commit violence. They shouldn't. It's bad. Writing it down on paper doesn't magically make it not happen. He says, quote, if you believe in the non-aggression principle, whose job is it to enforce it? First of all, everybody's. Second, well, he gets to his main problem in his thinking in a minute. So, if someone breaks into your home and you are unable to defend yourselves or pay for private security, who do you call? Well, if you call the cops now, they'll show up in 15 minutes and write a report about whatever happened to you and draw a chalk line around your body. The government already doesn't do any good for that. But again, the implication, and in classic statist mode, he won't come out and say it. It's the insinuation, like, well, if people only have the security that they pay for or that somebody else is willing to give them, well, first of all, he pretends nobody else would be willing to help them at all if you don't pay them. He just sort of throws that little insinuation in there. But the implication is, so we have to tax everybody to have a government to protect them. And he, a couple times he'll actually say that. Well, he won't say it that honestly. He'll do it with the euphemisms. We have to provide resources. Well, what does that mean? It means steal your money by threat of force. So if someone breaks into your home, who do you call? Well, he's talking as if there's some magic guarantee that there always has to be a good guy there to stop every bad thing happening. That's not reality. With or without a government, that's never reality. But the statist mindset is we need an all-powerful nanny state that guarantees bad things won't happen. And when it not only fails to guarantee that bad things won't happen, but makes bad things worse, they still won't let go of their intellectual security blanket of authoritarianism and say, but we need it to do what it has never done in the history of the world. The whole notion of we need a government that just protects individual rights. Name one anywhere in the world at any point in history that only did that. You can't. There never has been one. So statists push for an institution to do something that it has never done in the history of the world. And then when people say, maybe because we actually want individual rights protected, we shouldn't have the institution that is by far the single biggest violator of those rights everywhere in the world throughout all of history, to still say, no, I'm clinging to my emotional security blanket because I'm scared of the concept of a free world in which we're just human beings and we don't have a mythical deity called government to save us. And he talks about, what do you do if you have a dispute with your neighbor? This goes into the category of the ultimate decider thing. It's like, well, what if people disagree about something? And this comes up later in number 5, so I'll save it for then. But he wants the ultimate decider, that they get to make the final decision and determination, as if somehow government's going to always make the right determination. All they're going to do is usually make the wrong one and then put lots of guns on the side of the wrong decision. Quote, in an anarchist state, no one is responsible for defending life, liberty, or property unless they are paid to do so. That's just a stupid thing to say. That's just stupid. By his own statement, if somebody attacked him and there weren't politicians and cops around, he would just go, oh, it's not my job to defend myself. And I'm sure nobody else would ever do anything to defend. Again, I think he's projecting. I think this basically means, tell me how this couldn't mean this, that if he saw someone being victimized, he would stand there and frickin' watch or just run away. Because his mentality is, nobody is responsible for defending life, liberty, or property unless they're paid to. And he's not paid to. He doesn't think he's responsible to help protect other people from aggressors. He wants a nanny state to do it. So, again, it's statists projecting their irresponsibility and immorality. And he has to end number 3 with this line, sad, pathetic, Stockholm Syndrome projecting fear-mongering. In Ancapistan, no one can hear you scream, and no one cares. First of all, there's so much about that. There's such a psychological projection of his own fear, his own insecurity, his own cowardice, his own irresponsibility, to declare it's cowardly and elitist at the same time. Nobody will care if somebody's hurting you unless we have a ruling class. How demented do you have to be to actually believe that? And you know, if you even think things out, which obviously he doesn't, why do people vote for a government to protect them if none of them care about being protected? It's like, why do people vote to care for the poor if none of them care about the poor? Every time a vote wins, it means that there are enough people who care about something that they could have just done it themselves instead of going to a ruling class to violently dominate them and then do a really bad, inefficient job of protecting them and being the biggest victimizer around. But in Ancapistan, no one can hear you scream and no one cares. That's just pathetic. Grow up. Number 4, the non-aggression principle. I didn't sign shit. And he starts, the non-aggression principle is a social contract. No, it freaking isn't. And he makes up this straw man bad argument to respond to people making fun of the Constitution. He says, the non-aggression principle is a social contract, but I didn't sign it, neither did the enemies of liberty. It's not a social contract. It's a moral statement about something being bad. The non-aggression principle doesn't magically make anything happen. Writing it on paper doesn't make any difference. It is a statement that says initiating violence is wrong. It's simply a description of a moral principle. That's all it is. Now, people can abide by it or they cannot abide by it. Austin chooses not to abide by it and advocates the mass extortion of lots of people he doesn't know by way of government. Lots of people, myself and lots of people who watch my videos, do abide by it. It's not a contract. We didn't agree to it. Like, well, I don't think murder's bad because I never signed a thing saying I agree that murder's bad or I agree not to murder. He's trying to hallucinate it into being a social contract so that the same criticism that applies to the Constitution would apply to it. But it obviously doesn't because it has nothing to do with a contract. And here he goes. Anarchist, singular, often sneer at constitutionalists, arguing that they didn't sign the document, nor did they agree to it. Yeah, that's because the Constitution actually pretends to create superhuman rights of Congress, the ruling class, and I didn't agree to that, and nobody agreed to that. For a total slaughtering of the mythology of the Constitution, see No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority by Lysander Spooner. He just slices and dices that thing to shreds. Incidentally, the Constitution isn't a social contract either. He's mixing up two concepts. The Constitution is a nothing contract. The social contract is the mythology that, well, your being here means you agree to be ruled by whoever claims this as their political territory, which is bogus for other reasons. The non-aggression principle is a social contract, he says again, but there is zero obligation to live by it. This is extremely telling. I'm not sure how much he thought about it before typing these words. Austin Petersen thinks there is zero obligation to live by the non-aggression principle. If you live near him, you might want to keep that in mind. He feels zero obligation to refrain from attacking other people. Because that's all the non-aggression principle says, is it's wrong to attack other people. And he says people have zero obligation to abide by it. Wow. Okay. Indeed, it gets even worse. Indeed, it would be dangerously naive to submit to any form of a non-aggression principle. For as soon as one party signs, those who have not could feel free to decline. It's not a thing you sign. It's a description of a principle. And everyone who chooses to live life in a pacific state, as in pacifistic, peaceful, not the west side of the country. Everyone who chooses to live life in a pacific state would be easy prey for those who do not live according to that principle. Again, he's first of all, this is a guy who pretended he used to be an anarcho-capitalist. And to show this much complete ignorance and misunderstanding of what the belief system is shows that he's just freaking lying. Maybe once upon a time he wore that label because he thought it sounded cool, but he obviously has no idea what it means. The non-aggression principle doesn't mean you're not allowed to defend yourself. That's why the word aggression is in there. It's not the non-force principle. It's the non-aggression principle. And so he's saying, if other people don't sign a thing about the non-aggression, I've never signed a thing about the non-aggression principle, then they can just attack us. So it's dangerous to submit to any form of non-aggression. That's how he puts it, which is just weird. It's dangerous to think you shouldn't attack other people because then other people might attack you. That's his argument, which shows that he just doesn't understand what he's talking about. Also, in many cases, the non-aggression principle forbids the basic principle of a preemptive attack for the purpose of self-defense. Well, actually, no, it doesn't. I mean, there's a debate of where the line is, like, you know, okay, somebody's coming at me with a gun. Do I have to wait till it's pointed at my head? If he's running up my front steps, anger on his face, and he just said, I'm going to kill you, do I have to wait till the gun is pointed at me before it counts as self-defense? Like, you can argue where the line is, but that's just arguing what's defense and what's aggression. That's arguing what counts as aggression and what doesn't. And that has nothing to do with saying aggression is bad. Whatever's on that side of the line, don't do that because that's bad. Whatever's on this side, that's justified. So to use the argument of where the line is to condemn the principle makes no sense. And he does a similar thing of saying anarchists argue that there is no harm, no crime. A lot of people do say no victim, no crime, which is a bit of an oversimplification. If somebody tried to murder you and missed, that's still a crime, even though there wasn't a victim because it was a bad shot. So he brings up the examples of what if somebody aims a gun at you, and what if somebody aims a nuke at you, and when is self-defense justified? And that's a perfectly useful debate, but it has nothing to do, like, again, it's where do we draw the line of what counts as defense and what counts as aggression? But to use that uncertainty in the argument over where that line goes to say, so heck with the non-aggression principle, aggression is great. It's just unprincipled and stupid. It's like saying, well, murder is great, and we shouldn't be against murder because there are some cases where it's hard to tell what counts as murder and what counts as justifiable homicide. So therefore, the whole notion of being against murder is totally bogus and naive and dangerous. Then he makes this really weird statement. I'll read it just for entertainment value. Is there any level of collateral damage acceptable in defending oneself from attack? If there is collateral damage, should there be forced redistributive justice against the citizens defending themselves and to those unfairly harmed as a consequence of being in proximity to destroying the nuclear weapons launch pad? So this is the scenario about the nuke. So he's basically saying, if there's a nuke It's okay to blow the hell out of a whole bunch of people in the area, but then it's okay to rob the people who did it to give some of their money to the victims of the innocent people they just killed. That's the statist solution to society's problems. That's awesome. That doesn't even deserve a rebuttal. In even the most rudimentary of scenarios, the non-aggression principle does not provide for the means of adequate self-defense, not in national defense or personal. That's just totally, utterly wrong. All the non-aggression principle states is that defense is okay, aggression isn't. You can argue about where the line is, but he's basically saying you shouldn't attack people makes it so you can't defend yourself. No, it doesn't. It's like saying eating broccoli makes it so you can't drive a car. They have nothing to do with each other. Number 5, who defines what is private property? An anarchist society can attempt to define what... Oh, and he goes on about, again, this is the thing of who's the final decider. Who gets to determine who owns what. And statists often do this. It's like, but there might be disputes, so we need a gigantically powerful government that's going to pick one side and enforce it. As if that will somehow magically make sure the right side is picked every time. And anybody who knows anything about government knows that isn't how it happens. Often the wrong side gets picked, and then it has lots of armed thugs with guns behind it, and then the right side is shit out of luck. But that's the ultimate decider mentality thing that statists want. And he ends with, an anarchist society can attempt to define what is truly property, but they cannot enforce it even if they all agree. I can't even figure out what he was trying to say. Like, does he really think that in a voluntary society, if you break into somebody's house, they're going to say, well, I can't defend myself, I can't shoot you because we don't have politicians or tax collectors, so, oh well. Like, we all agreed that this was an act of aggression you committed against me, but for some reason, we can't enforce that. We can't defend ourselves. It's just a weird, utterly baseless, obviously false assertion. So I don't even know how to rebut it because there's no rationale to it. It's like saying people who wear hats can't defend themselves. Like, there isn't a rebuttal to that other than, duh, yes they can. Okay, so that's the end of his article. I wanted to give the 5 real reasons why Austin Petersen is not an anarchist. 1, he's completely ignorant. He doesn't understand political philosophy, he doesn't understand the Constitution, he doesn't understand what anarchism actually is, which tells me he never was one. He may have worn the label because it sounded cool, but he obviously has no understanding of the actual principles. Number 2 reason he's not an anarchist, because he's totally hypocritical. He talks about, and minarchists always do this, we have our individual rights and life and liberty and blah, 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 but we get to force you to fund what we think is important, for example, defense. You don't get to force us to fund what you might think is important, like a welfare state or schools or whatever else, but we get to force our opinion on you. Now, I confess, I totally did that when I was a constitutionalist and minarchist. I was completely hypocritical. I was a statist dupe. I advocated that millions of people I knew nothing about be robbed to pay for something because I thought it was important. Protection and police and military and all that. The reason I became an anarchist is because I got over that piece of hypocrisy and realized, hey, if other people have to leave me in freedom, I have to leave them in freedom, which means ruling class cannot be illegitimate. Number 3 reason that Austin is actually an anarchist is because he's rational and doesn't really understand the concepts, and his logic is just randomly all over the place. Number 4 is because he is immoral and wants to be able to violently control other people by way of the nanny state to make them be what he wants them to be and to make them pay for what he wants to have and what he thinks is important. And number 5, he's not an anarchist because he is dishonest. Notice that after claiming to be an anarchist, he uses all the dodges, all the evasions, all the euphemisms, and won't just come right out and say, yes, I believe in using the force of government to deprive millions of people I don't know of their money to pay for this. He does the classic statist spin and don't mention that part and talk about this way we can work together and provide the benefits of blah, 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 and carefully not mention the other stuff. And that's intellectual dishonesty. Now, what I don't know is whether he is intentionally intellectually dishonest or just dishonest to himself. When I was a statist, I was dishonest to myself and didn't even know it. somewhere in me, I felt the contradictions and would kind of tap dance around them. It may be that's what he's doing. I did it for years, kind of embarrassing to admit, but I admit it. And it does matter, because if somebody is lying to themselves, then it is possible that if they think about things enough and are honest with what they believe and what they advocate, they can become clear in the head and do away with the contradictions and then be a voluntarist. But you can't be a voluntarist if you believe, you can't be consistent if you believe in government at all. My challenge to Austin Petersen, to end this off, would be to answer the 5 questions that I will be sending to 200 political philosophy professors across the country. 5 simple questions in my campaign called Government on Trial. I want to see if moral, principled, honest, intellectual, informed, enlightened Austin Petersen can answer directly and specifically 5 very basic questions about his own belief and what he advocates as far as politics and government. So Austin, please let me know what your answers are to those 5 questions.